Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Rajkumar. I'm the International Investigations Editor for the Associated Press, and I'm also a governor on the Overseas Press Club board. So I am here today with two very distinguished journalists. One of them, Anand Gopal, is a writer for The New Yorker, a member of the OPC since 2016, and a four-time winner of the OPC's Ed Cunningham Award for Best Magazine-Style Long-Form Feature Writing. Anand has also written a book that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And Anand's editor, Harper's, was the first prominent magazine to publish Anand's work under editor Chris Cox. And they published a story about Syria and a story about Afghanistan. Chris is now at New York Magazine after stints at Harper's, GQ, and the New York Times Magazine. He's worked on stories that have won the Pulitzer Prize, multiple magazine awards, also the Ed Cunningham Award, etc. So I am very pleased and honored to be here with them. So we'll get started because we don't have a lot of time. This panel is called How I Did It. So I'd like to take that both in the big sense of the word and the micro sense. So in the big sense, I think what a lot of people would like to know is how did Anand break into the kind of stories he's doing? And we now know we have Chris to thank for that, but I would love to know more. And then I think in the micro sense, I really would love to know a lot more about Anand's process and also what you look for, Chris, in terms of finding a narrative, shaping the narrative, what sort of reporting goes into it, etc. So why don't we start? Anand, do you want to give us a really sort of a quick synopsis of how you got into this kind of work? You're a sociologist by training, and you are an academic. How did you get into writing, and how did you eventually end up meeting Chris?
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, actually, in my first career, I was a physicist, or basically doing physical sciences, math and physics. And I lived in New York during 9/11, during the attacks, and I saw the attacks. And like a lot of us, I was very affected by what I saw. And I started to follow the news, especially about the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, pretty closely. And eventually, a few years later, I decided that I should try to go to one of these countries and try to understand better myself what's going on. I didn't really have a ambition of being a journalist or a writer at that point. I just kind of wanted to go. So I went to Afghanistan, as it turned out. And once there, I started to freelance, and that's how I kind of fell into it.
Okay. So Anand and Chris, can you tell me about how the two of you first got together? I understand it included a recommendation. And Chris, would you tell me what you found striking and persuasive about Anand's initial pitch? So Anand, you want to talk about the recommendation?
Well, maybe Chris should talk about it.
I was going to say, actually, Chris, you
remember it better than I do.
Yeah, maybe you didn't even know about it. Or at least you didn't know the wording of the email that I got. But yes, no, Anand was sent to me via Matthew Akins, who is another reporter who's probably a lot of the people here have read his work before, but he was reporting mainly from Afghanistan at the time, and had written some things for Harper's Magazine, where I was an editor. And I edited one of those stories by the time that he recommended Anand to me. And he just sent me an email, and he said something along the lines of, Anand is a brilliant reporter and probably my closest competition here in Afghanistan. So I'd rather he be, writing for Harper's than anywhere else. And I got that email, and then very quickly set up a meeting with Anand. I thought the best way to sort of get to know him, because he was at that moment in New York, would be to meet face to face. I think it was even like just 2 days after that first email that we met. And that's by no means a requirement to, get a relationship going with an editor, but it was helpful to have that. We could sort of talk in a more like freewheeling way about what he was interested in, the work he'd done before, that kind of stuff. But then it was still a good 6 months or something before he sent me a pitch that ended up getting assigned. So it took a little bit of back and forth before we arrived at our first story, which is about Syria. But in some other ways, it's kind of quick to go from first meeting to assigned magazine story in 6 months. So, I was grateful to Matt for setting the whole process on its way.
So, by the way, I have warned Matthew Akins that he will be flooded with requests for recommendations.
Yeah.
So he does know that. So I was going to ask, so tell me more about that Syria pitch and more in general about the pitches. Where do they come from? Was that something that you had found, Anand? And if so, what was your process? Had you already been to Syria at the time? Or was it something that you and Chris talked about and you said, hey, I have this great idea that I'd love to go to Syria? What was the process? How did that pitch come across?
So this would have been, I think, 2011, 2012, in that period. So the Arab Spring was in full force. And so I was reporting on that for various outlets. And I had been in Libya and Egypt. Chris, if I remember, we started actually talking about Egypt initially.
Yep.
Battered on some ideas about Egypt, and then and I'd been wanting to go to Syria at the same time, and so eventually I decided to go to Syria. And at that point in the Syrian conflict, most of the territories on the Turkish border were under the control of the Syrian regime, so it was tricky getting in. But so I didn't want to pitch anything before knowing I can get in, because I didn't know what the story would be, except that I was there. So I went to Turkey and hung out there for a little while and met some Syrians who had fled and other activists, Syrian activists and others, and eventually went across the border with them. And then once there, I went to a town that had just witnessed a massacre by the Syrian government. And I think I went into that town a few days after the massacre. So now obviously I knew that I had a pitchable story. So then when I left, that's when I wrote to Chris. Okay. And how at that point did you guys handle the story? As in, Anand, when you wrote to Chris, did you already have a pretty clear idea of what it was going to be? Or was that something that you and Chris discussed? How did you handle discussions on what the structure was going to be, the main characters? Because it strikes me in this case, it sounds like you did a majority of the reporting before you actually got out. So how did you handle that? And did you ever find that Chris wanted to know things that you hadn't reported on? Yeah, in this case, I think I reported the entire story before the pitch, just by the nature of being in Syria at that time. But Chrissy, do you remember some of the details? You probably remember better than I do.
Yes, and I went back and looked at some of our correspondence to refresh my memory. So yeah, it's very unusual for a story, for a pitch to arrive after all the reporting has been done. Normally, it's an idea for a reporting project, and then the editor will say yes or no. In this case, yeah, because of what Anand said about going into Syria, that wasn't the way it worked. So I knew that we had basically only to work with what he had seen while he was there. But he'd seen a lot. So, I mean, the bulk of that story is just his pure on the ground, like reporting of what he saw, who he talked to. In an ideal world, sure, maybe we would have had follow-up interviews, that kind of stuff, but it just obviously wasn't possible. And so the structural work we did, I think Anna pitched the story, and it was like beautifully written pitch, and got the assignment pretty quickly, basically because of that. Really like vivid descriptive writing in the pitch itself. And then after the story was assigned, I just asked him, okay, great, let's talk about how the story is going to be actually told. And he wrote an outline. And then we did a little bit of back and forth on the outline, basically saying like, okay, this block of information goes here, maybe these two can be combined, that kind of stuff. And then we agreed on the basic structure of the story. And then he got to work on a draft, and pretty quickly after that, a couple of weeks, it was done, or the first draft was done.
Okay.